the most cringeworthy picture in the history of American politics. Right? That after Mitt Romney had delivered this absolutely scathing and I think quite eloquent speech denouncing Donald Trump early on, trying to derail the nomination, after all of his attempts, to find ways to have an alternative to Donald Trump, as you point out, he did as much as any Republican in America did in 2016 to try to stop Donald Trump. But then there's that moment. Trump is elected. It's in the transition. And over frogs' legs. Is that true, by the way, that they were having frogs' legs?
It's actually not frogs' legs, apparently. Okay. According to Romney, it was something else. But that became part of the lore.
Yeah, the part of the lore. It's almost too good to check. But anyway, he's sitting there with Donald Trump, and he's talking about becoming Donald Trump's Secretary of State. How the hell did that happen? And what does he think about that now?
Well, he's mostly glad that he didn't take the job, that he didn't end up in the administration. But no, I'm saying that's his primary reaction. Like, thank goodness. In fact, I interviewed George W. Bush about this, who had encouraged Mitt to take it, and he said he really dodged a bullet. But what was happening was after Trump won in 2016. Romney and a lot of people like him considered it basically an emergency, right? This madman that has no business being in the Oval Office has won. He's going to be in control of the United States government, and we need adults in the room. You remember this argument, right? This was a very common line of conversation.
We're gonna hear it again
in the months after 2016. And so when Mike Pence actually was the first one to approach him, Mike Pence called him and said, the president-elect wants to meet with you about Secretary of State. Romney initially demurred and then eventually agreed to at least take the meeting. And it was because he thought that he could help steer the country, in the right direction in this very perilous moment, right? But it's funny because asking Romney about it now, he says, he kind of admits to me, on the one hand, there was this noble part of my thinking, which is, I want to be helpful. I want to be patriotic. I want to help the country. But there was this other line of thinking, which is, I just wanted the job. I wanted to be in the middle of the action. He said to me, I wanted to be president of the United States.
Yeah.
Right. He said, I wanted to be president of the United States. If you can't get that job, Secretary of State is a pretty good consolation prize. And so he admits that this almost was kind of the last temptation of Mitt, right? It was like the last opportunity, the last chance to kind of
sell
out.
A hell of a drug, right?
Exactly. And ultimately, the breaking point for him, in his version, the reason he didn't get this job was that Trump basically told him, I want to give it to you, but you have to go out there and retract everything that you said about me during the 2016 campaign. You have to say that I'm going to be a great president, that you were wrong about all of it. And Romney just couldn't get there. He said that would be ridiculous. Nobody would believe it. And I wouldn't believe it. And I'm not going to do that. And, he tried to. There's this, after that dinner, he went out and talked to the press, and he kind of went as far as he was willing to go. He said, Trump has appointed a lot of great people, and I'm hopeful that this administration will do great things. But it wasn't enough. Trump called him after that and said, you have to go further. Romney wouldn't. After the fact, a lot of Trump
people grovel harder.
Exactly.
He had to go full
I think
Lindsey Graham, right? He had to go,
Well, and, Romney, I think at that point, he was just too, he wouldn't give up that much of his dignity to get the job. Okay. And what he says is, in retrospect, I'm so glad I didn't, because Romney had all these conditions he laid out for Trump. He said, I'll do this if, we have a weekly meeting. I have veto power over ambassadors. That was one of his conditions, because he was worried about who Trump would appoint as ambassadors. He said, I want full control over sub-cabinet appointments, and I want foreign policy to flow completely from the State Department. And he said immediately Trump would have violated all of those, and I wouldn't have lasted more than a few months, right? So anyway, it's an interesting moment.
So let's fast forward just a little bit. Okay, so he runs for the United States Senate in Utah. He wins. What did he think the Senate was going to be like? What did he think his role in the Senate was going to be? Because as I recall, one of the first things that he did, I think even before he was sworn in, was to write a piece for the Washington Post where he said, I'm still a conservative. I'm going to vote for Republican issues, but I'm also not going to hesitate to call out the character of the president. I mean, he kind of signaled right from the moment he walked in that he was going to continue to be outspokenly anti-Trump. So how did he think it was going to go?
Well, he had this idea, and one of the things he gave me was the pros and cons list he had written out for himself when he was considering whether to run for Senate. And you can imagine, a lot of the cons were lifestyle considerations. He'd be away from his wife and family. And the pros were issues that he wanted to address. But in that pros and cons list, he wrote out a line from the Yeats poem, The Second Coming, that he felt kind of embodied or captured what the Republican Party in the Trump era was. And he wrote, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are filled with passionate intensity." He believed that if he got to the Senate, he was, this elder statesman of the party, the former nominee of the party, that he could get there and kind of empower and embolden the best in the party who still, were good people. They were just sort of afraid of Donald Trump and didn't know what to do. And he had this idea that he could steer the party away from Trumpism just by being there to encourage them. And what he found out was, once he got to the Senate, was that the problem was much more dire than he realized. The situation was much worse. These senators did not want to be steered away from Trumpism. They were so desperately clinging to their seats and their power and the trappings and their offices and their staffs that they weren't willing to do anything that might compromise their reelection prospects. And that was really dispiriting for him.
And then he ended up being the man alone, sitting by himself at lunch. Nobody wanted to sit with him. I mean, that's kind of.
I mean, he talks about going into those Senate Republican caucus lunches, especially as he became more and more of a target of Donald Trump's and became more outspoken about, his fellow Republicans. He said it reminded him of the high school cafeteria. He would walk into the Senate caucus lunches and he'd look around and be like, who am I going to sit next to? He often felt when he raised his hand to make a comment that people were rolling their eyes or sort of whispering about him. He actually became a little paranoid during the first impeachment trial because he would write in his journals that he would see people kind of gesturing in his direction and talking, and he would imagine what they were saying about him. I mean, it really was just a deeply unpleasant situation for him. And I imagine continues to be so because he's only become more outspoken, especially since this book has come out.
Well, and of course, the key decision, and maybe the defining decision of his political career, was when he decides that he is going to be the only Republican senator to vote to convict Donald Trump in that impeachment trial. He had to know at that point that that was it for him. That he was going to be a pariah, that he was going to be excommunicated. So talk to me about that decision, how hard that decision was for him. And he had to understand that being absolutely alone meant that he was not guiding the party in any particular way, but he was blowing himself up.
He agonized over it. I mean, I have his journals from that first impeachment trial. He wanted so badly to vote to acquit Trump and just kind of be in the mainstream of the Republican Party. He would often write out the worst case scenarios of what would happen to him and his family if he voted to convict Trump. He was worried about the safety of his family. He was worried about, his various sons getting audited or getting targeted in some way by the Trump administration. But in the end, he just couldn't live with himself knowing that Trump was guilty. He had, poured over the evidence. He had taken it very seriously. He felt there was no question Trump was guilty of abuse of power. And he was at a point in his career where he just said, I can't take another vote that I don't believe in. I can't do this, keep doing this, right? The way that every other Republican has just sold themselves out. He decided to do what he thought was right. And I think you're right that he knew that was sort of the end of it for him in the Republican Party.
So that was the decision that he decided that he was going to follow the example of his father, George, from 1964, that he would be the one man sitting down. In his case, he was the one man standing up. So that was a real breaking point for him. You tell a story that's gotten a lot of attention, though, that he got a call from Paul Ryan, his running mate. And Paul Ryan, of course, and I've known Paul a long time. He's been trying to walk this very, very, careful line of, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, staying relevant. So he called him up and tried to talk him into not voting to impeach Donald Trump. So
it was actually the last call Romney got before he went out and gave his speech saying that he was going to vote to convict. Somehow word had leaked out in Romney's orbit, and Paul Ryan called his cell and basically said, I heard you're going to do this. Are you sure you want to do this? And, there have been different characterizations of this call. I heard about this first from somebody on Romney's, who was on Romney's Senate staff at the time. I asked Romney about it. I asked Paul Ryan about it later, who confirmed that they spoke and confirmed some of the essential details without necessarily confirming the full characterization. But basically what Paul Ryan said on that call, according to my reporting, is this is going to, be extremely damaging to your place in the Republican Party. You could lose friends. People who supported our campaign are probably going to cut you off and be very upset with you. Are you sure you've thought through the consequences of this? Basically, also Paul Ryan told him that he didn't believe that Trump was guilty. He said that, I don't think you should vote this way.
Yeah.
So
it's one thing to say I'm worried about you. It's another thing to say I'm actually now endorsing the Trump position.
So there are two different arguments being made there. I mean, Romney ultimately kind of said I know what I want to do and hung up and then went out and gave a speech.
So what is their relationship now? What does Mitt Romney think of Paul Ryan, particularly after your story broke about this?
I think that Romney I think he has a lot of just personal affection for Paul Ryan. In some ways, I think he thinks of Paul Ryan as like a son. You could tell, even reading his journals and talking to him, that he was much less judgmental of Paul Ryan's capitulations to Trump than he was of other Republicans. And I think it just comes down to him really, loving Paul Ryan on like a personal level. And, I saw that they appeared together at the Park City Summit that Romney holds every year earlier this year after that story first came out. So my sense is that their relationship is okay. But, this is one of the tricky things about this book. He wanted to document, and I wanted to document, the hypocrisy and cynicism that he has seen behind closed doors. And I'm sure it's put a strain on a lot of his relationships, but he felt like it was important enough to risk those things.
Yeah. McKay Coppins, it is an outstanding book. The book is Romney, A Reckoning, and it is definitely worth your time. McKay Coppins, thank you for coming back on the Bulwark podcast. I appreciate it very much.
Hey, thank you so much, Charlie. Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for listening to today's Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We will be back tomorrow, and we'll do this all over again.